Salt of the earth. Most people hear that phrase and think it means someone is a good person. Humble, kind, down to earth, reliable. The kind of person who treats people right and does not act better than everybody else. And that is not a terrible way to use the phrase in everyday speech. But when Jesus said it in Matthew 5, he was saying something heavier than, be a nice person. He said, you are the salt of the earth. Then he added, but if salt loses its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? That line should make us slow down. Because Jesus was not just giving his followers a compliment. He was giving them an identity and a warning. In the ancient world, salt mattered. It was not just something sitting on a kitchen table. Salt preserved food. Salt gave flavor. Salt was connected to purity. Salt was connected to covenant. Salt was valuable. Salt helped slow decay. So when Jesus called his followers the salt of the earth, he was not saying, you are just decent people. He was saying they had a purpose in the world. They were supposed to carry a preserving influence. They were supposed to bring the flavor of God's kingdom into ordinary life. They were supposed to live in a way that resisted corruption. They were supposed to be visibly different without becoming arrogant. That is a much stronger meaning. This matters because Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount. Right before he says, you are the salt of the earth, he gives the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. Then he says, you are the salt of the earth. So the salt is not random. It is connected to the kind of people he just described. People who are humble before God. People who grieve what is broken. People who do not use power the way the world uses power. People who hunger for righteousness. People who show mercy. People who seek peace. People who remain faithful under pressure. That is what gives the salt its saltiness. Not church language. Not religious performance. Not looking holy in public. Not winning arguments. Not acting morally superior. The salt is the visible life of the kingdom. It is what happens when people are formed by God so deeply that their presence affects the world around them. But here is where the warning comes in. Jesus says if salt loses its taste, it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. That sounds strong because it is strong. Jesus is saying that if his people lose the very thing that makes them distinct, they lose their purpose. If they become just as proud, just as cruel, just as greedy, just as bitter, just as dishonest, just as status-hungry, just as unforgiving, and just as corrupt as the world around them, then what exactly are they preserving? What are they flavoring? What are they showing? That is the raw part. A believer can use spiritual language and still lose saltiness. A church can have activity and still lose saltiness. A person can quote scripture and still lose saltiness. Because saltiness is not just what we say. It is the character, faithfulness, mercy, courage, humility, and righteousness that show God's kingdom in real life. This is why reducing salt of the earth to good person is too small. Jesus was not calling his people to basic human decency only. He was calling them to covenant faithfulness in public life. He was calling them to be the kind of people whose lives push back against decay. Think about what salt does. Salt does not have to become the meat in order to preserve the meat. Salt does not have to become the whole meal in order to affect the meal. Salt works by being present and remaining what it is. That is important. Because some believers think influence means becoming exactly like the surrounding culture. Same values. Same fears. Same pride. Same entertainment. Same greed. Same bitterness. Same hunger for attention. Same way of speaking. Same way of treating enemies. Same way of handling money. Same way of chasing status. But if salt becomes indistinguishable from everything around it, then it is no longer functioning as salt. On the other side, some believers think being salt means being harsh, loud, and unpleasant. As if the goal is to irritate everybody in the name of truth. But that is not right either. Salt has strength, but it also has purpose. It preserves. It seasons. It brings out what should be there. It does not exist just to burn the tongue. So the way of Jesus is not blending in completely, and it is not becoming needlessly offensive. It is faithful presence. Different but not arrogant. Clear but not cruel. Holy but not performative. Merciful but not morally loose. Truthful but not hateful. That balance is hard. But that is why Jesus teaches it. In Leviticus 2, salt appears with offerings. In Numbers 18, there is language about a covenant of salt. In the ancient world, salt could carry the idea of durability, loyalty, and covenant faithfulness. So when Jesus speaks of salt, his Jewish listeners would not only think about taste. They could also hear deeper echoes of faithfulness, offering, purity, and covenant life. That gives his words more weight. He is not just saying, be useful. He is saying, be faithful to what you are called to be. And when he says earth, he is not limiting this to private religion. He says, you are the salt of the earth. That means this calling has public meaning. The life of God's people should matter in the world. Not through domination. Not through pride. Not by forcing people to pretend. But by being a faithful witness to another way of living. A way where mercy is real. Where righteousness matters. Where truth is not for sale. Where the weak are not despised. Where enemies are not treated as less than human. Where money is not worshipped. Where status is not the highest good. Where forgiveness does not mean pretending evil is fine. Where love is not just a feeling, but a way of life shaped by God. That kind of life slows decay. That kind of life seasons the world. That kind of life makes people notice something different. Not because the person is trying to look impressive, but because faithfulness has a flavor. That is what Jesus is getting at. The danger is that modern people often want the identity without the responsibility. We like being called salt. We like being called light. We like being called chosen. We like being called blessed. But those words are not trophies. They are assignments. To be salt means your life is supposed to carry the taste of the kingdom. Not just in church. Not just when praying. Not just when people agree with you. But in ordinary situations. When someone insults you. When money is involved. When you have power over somebody. When nobody is watching. When your enemy is vulnerable. When telling the truth costs you. When it would be easier to blend in. That is where saltiness shows. A person is not salt because they claim a label. A person is salt when their life carries the preserving, faithful, distinct character of the kingdom Jesus preached. And this connects directly to the next image Jesus gives. Right after salt, he says, "You are the light of the world." A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. So salt and light belong together. Salt speaks of faithful influence. Light speaks of visible witness. One preserves. One reveals. Both require distinction. Both require purpose. Both warn against hiding or losing what makes God's people different. So when we hear salt of the earth, we should hear more than be nice. Kindness matters, but Jesus is going deeper. He is saying, you are here for a purpose. Your life should resist decay. Your presence should carry kingdom flavor. Your faithfulness should be real enough to affect the world around you. And if that distinctiveness disappears, something serious has been lost. That does not mean believers should walk around thinking they are better than everyone else. That would actually be losing saltiness. Pride is not salt. Hypocrisy is not salt. Religious arrogance is not salt. Cruel truth-telling is not salt. Public holiness with private corruption is not salt. The salt Jesus describes comes out of the Beatitudes. Humility, mercy, purity of heart, hunger for righteousness, peacemaking, endurance under pressure. That is kingdom salt. And it still matters. Because the world does not need believers who only know how to repeat religious phrases. The world does not need believers who blend into every form of corruption and then claim grace as an excuse. The world does not need believers who are loud but not faithful. The world does not need believers who are correct but loveless. The world needs people who have actually been shaped by the way of Jesus. People whose lives make truth visible. People whose mercy is not fake. People whose faithfulness holds under pressure. People whose presence brings something clean into polluted places. That is salt. So no, salt of the earth does not simply mean a good, humble person. It means a faithful kingdom presence in a world that decays without God's way. It means carrying the flavor of righteousness, mercy, humility, and covenant loyalty into ordinary life. It means being different enough to matter, but humble enough not to turn that difference into pride. That is the challenge. That is the calling. And that is why Jesus did not say, "Try to become salt." He said, "You are the salt of the earth." The question is not whether his people have a calling. The question is whether we are still carrying the flavor of that calling. Ancient context. Clearer scripture.